Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to this book club of the Lotus Eaters on Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals, which I'll be discussing with Connor.
Hello.
It'll only be the first two essays in it, though, because not this weekend, but next weekend, I have a Contemplations coming up with Josh, which is to discuss the third essay, which is the ascetic ideal. So in this one, we'll be talking about the first two essays, which are, if I can remind myself, Good and Evil and Good and Bad, and the origin of bad conscience. So this is something we're going to be just trying to extract what Nietzsche is actually trying to say with all of this, because of course he makes himself deliberately impenetrable as a gatekeeping mechanism against the midwits, and so we've got to try and prove ourselves not to be midwits here.
Well, I remember his quote. I can't remember exactly which book it was, but it was saying, "I can say what most people can't even, what most people take a book to say in a sentence. No, they can't even say it in a book."
Yes.
And so he did believe in his own intellectual fortitude, definitely.
Oh yeah, he's very aggressive at it, actually. I mean, in the preface, he even says, well, look, people don't take aphorisms seriously, which is why I write in aphorisms. And then unless you've ruminated on this for a great deal of time, then you're not going to understand it, and you shouldn't understand it. But so he begins with a preface, which is written in Nietzschean style, as you might imagine. And he begins by telling us that basically he hates the way that the English look at the world, and the English origin, the origins of moral, the genealogy of morals, from Dr. Paul Ree's The Origin of Moral Sensations, was a book that he picked up, read, and he wasn't even angry at it. He was just like, no, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong on every line, because apparently the English moralists see altruism as the bedrock of morality, which is of course the bedrock of Christian morality, but the English moralists didn't think about the idea that, well, actually pre-Christianity, there was a different kind of morality. And this is what Nietzsche is particularly concerned about. And so he says, look, the real issue is the value of morality, because he thinks that this kind of new pity-based morality is leading to a kind of nihilism in the absence of God. And this is something that he thinks acts as a kind of poison, in fact, to Europe. It has emptied the culture of its self-confidence, its self-regard, and is leading it down a dark path. Because he opens the question up saying, well, look, what if there was actually a new paradigm of morality? And I have a few quotes here that I think set the stage very well. He says, we need to stand in critique of moral values. The value of these values should first of all be called into question. Because what if, he says, there existed a symptom of regression in the good man, likewise a danger, a temptation, a poison, a narcotic, by means of which the present were living at the expense of the future, perhaps more comfortably and less dangerously, but also in less grand style, in a humbler manner. And I think that's really interesting, because if there's one thing that we can see happening in the world at the moment, it is that we are very much living in the present at the expense of the future. And this subtle narcotic that is in what we consider to be the good man, Peterson, I think, who is obviously a fan of Nietzsche in some ways, has pointed this out, saying the good man is not the harmless man.
Yep.
And that's what we've reduced the good man to being, is merely the harmless. And there is, I think, a narcotic in that.
Well, it's interesting because that doesn't necessarily conflict with the ideal of Christianity. I do wonder if Nietzsche read the interpretation of Beatitudes that says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Because obviously Peterson has popularized the retranslation of this, which is those who behave like a bridled battle horse, ready to champ at the bit, but don't charge, will inherit the earth. And it's like, it's the same thing as...
How did it ever get translated into the meek?
I don't quite know.
The bridled battle horse is not what I would consider to be a meek animal.
No, but this is where Peterson gets his idea of have the capacity to be a monster but demonstrate restraint.
Self-control, yeah.
Exactly. Well, there's a verse by Christ where he turns around and says, sell all you own so that you may at least own a sword.
See, I would approve of this slightly more pagan reinterpretation of Christianity through the lens of pagan values, at least, because I do think that there is some accuracy in saying, look, this view of meekness and sickness and weakness being a value, it's not a value.
No.
You know, it's not a virtue, it's a vice. And Peterson's reinterpretation of this and that retranslation, I think, is a much firmer ground for Christians to stand on these days.
It makes much more sense as well, because if Nietzsche says slave morality is the interrelativity, the social nature of morality, where you're meant to be of use to another, is a slave morality because you're subsuming your ambition to someone else. To rest meekness on that for Christianity doesn't quite add up, because if you're meek, as in if you're a servant to someone else, sure, but if you're incapable of defending someone else, then you're actually pretty useless to them.
What use are you at all?
Exactly. So the ability to be a monster with restraint actually makes you more of service to someone else. And so it would almost bolster his criticism in a way, in saying that Christianity makes you a servant, because you should be a servant willing to defend your master.
Yeah, there's no point in having a servant that can't do anything.
Exactly.
But okay, so we'll make sure this doesn't turn into Christian apology in the face of Nietzsche's relentless attacks. So we will, I think, for the sake of this discussion, accept what we could possibly call the mistranslation of the meek, the idea of venerating the weakest, the useless, because a lot of Nietzsche's critique hinged on that. And even if the Christians say, well, okay, actually, I prefer the battle horse analogy, which is fine. But there are also those people in the camp of the meek, of the helpless, who I think should be addressed, and which is what Nietzsche is trying to address.
Yeah, well, this is why modern leftists say Jesus was a socialist.
Yes,
and Nietzsche hated socialists with a passion. So
rightly so. So the first essay is Good and Evil and Good and Bad. And this is a really good thing for me to personally have read, because I actually had this discussion with Adam and Sitch a while ago. What's the difference between bad and evil? I wasn't really able to quite put my finger on it during that discussion. And it's only after reading this that I was like, okay, now I get it. So he believes that goodness, Nietzsche being a philologist, meant he studied language and like the etymology of words. And so he thinks that goodness is based on excellence and rank. And it's hard to disagree with that framing, isn't it?
In a meritocratic hierarchy, if it's based on competence, then yes, your ascension of the hierarchy would be meant to be a symbol of your competence.
Yeah.
But I think in what he's saying as well is that in the new slavish morality, that if you ascend the hierarchy, it's because you've suppressed others' masters' moralities.
Well, exactly. That's exactly right. So he believed that goodness was, of course, defined by those people who are the best at things. Say, quote, "The good themselves, that is, the noble, the powerful, the superior, the high-minded, were the ones who felt themselves and their actions to be good, that is, as of the first rank, and posited them as such in contrast to everything low, low-minded, common, and plebeian." And so essentially the excellent are arrogating the right to themselves to create values. And this, the good literally being good things and things that are desirable, well, of course, the powerful, aristocratic, competent people aggregate these goods as well to themselves. And so it's very easy to say that in this world, it must be someone of high rank that is of some sort of excellence that is capable of bringing to themselves the good things of the world. And so this is like where goodness and in positivity, like a positive view, and of excellence kind of harmonize into the same concept.
Yeah, well, conceptually, goodness would be defined by example. So rather than the good being arbitrarily set out, he said something in Twilight of the Idols where each philosopher's philosophy is only placable to the philosopher.
Yes.
And if it's inherited, it becomes a slave morality. So in a hierarchy where everyone's an indomitable Übermensch, for example, goodness would be the example set by success.
Yes.
But in a society that's governed by a slave morality, goodness is an arbitrary hand-me-down morality given to other people to pursue at the expense of their own self-interest, so that the person telling them how to act enriches themselves.
Because they themselves are not the progenitor of value.
Yeah, they themselves are not individual masters, but only masters comparatively.
Yeah. They didn't arrogate to themselves, as he says, the right to create value. They inherited value. And of course, utilitarianism is the opposite of this. And so he summarizes quite well, actually. Value to me versus value to others. That's a very black and white way of putting it. And it starts helping us to unpack what he means more clearly. And so good, he thinks, therefore, is essentially tied up with egotistic actions. And there's no real connection between good and unegotistic or altruistic actions. Utilitarianism, of course, being the expression of the herd instinct, which he feels takes a long time to predominate, but it eventually predominate. It does. Because it's always omnipresent in our thinking for some reason. But he doesn't actually tell us why. Anyway, so the etymological origins of the term good, he thinks all lead back to noble or aristocratic. Bad always comes from common, vulgar, or low. Good means to be adorned, bad means to be unadorned, and he is exceedingly critical of England on this point. The plebeians of England are very vulgar and low and common. So yes, that's possibly true. And also, one of the etymological roots or words that come out of good, and it's linked to, is truth. So the noble are truthful about their position in the world, as in we are at the top of the hierarchy. We are the ones who have captured the goods of society. We are the ones who are the creators of value, and there is a kind of honesty in owning it and projecting it. And so the sort of equalitarians are saying, oh, aren't we all the same?
Yeah.
No, we're not the same.
Yeah.
That's actually untrue.
See, I think part of this as well is where I sort of see the seeds of critical theory, except Nietzsche goes in the complete opposite direction.
They do draw from him.
Yeah, because obviously I know you've done the video on Nietzsche and the critical race theorists, and I did an article on how conservatives must abandon equality. And in the same thing there, they both have the same premise of there is no truth but power. Whereas Nietzsche says lean into it and become an indomitable Übermensch, and if you are dominated, that's your own fault.
Yeah.
Whereas the critical race theorists, the Marxists, they too say we need a relentless critique of all that exists, much like he said, a transvaluation of all values. But they transfer it into a pity morality. And they turn around and say, well, these people that are weak, we must rise up and become the new strong.
Well, what's interesting is about the critical race theorists is they're not even saying don't lean into it. What they're doing is just identifying their constituency, really. They're not saying, oh, they should remain weak. They're actually saying we should, in fact, commit to the sort of Nietzschean will to power and just lean into it ourselves.
Yeah.
And they have done.
Yeah, they both use nihilism as a springboard, but Nietzsche says, oh, try and transmute your own values as an independent person, and one says we're going to displace this individual nihilism with a collective ideological awakening.
And it is very much based in resentment. Like the whole movement is just resentment writ large, in fact. But anyway, but that's the point. The people at the top are essentially in pre-Christian antiquity being honest about, we're more powerful than you, so shut up or we'll kill you, which isn't very nice, but it is true. And they do get to essentially aggregate to themselves all those things that we think are good. And so this leads to a conflict between the priestly caste and the knightly caste. And this is where I think Nietzsche gets slightly too controversial for YouTube.
Yes.
Because so he points out that ancient concepts were kind of coarse and unsymbolic. It was actually all very, on the face of it. And so pure men were those who washed and didn't eat bad food and avoided low women. And so this sort of priestly metaphysic was against worldliness.
I think it's actually, and Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this as well, discuss sensitivity as a marker for conservatism. And it's, you are avoiding, in those things, you're avoiding bad food, you're avoiding disease, and you're avoiding parasites. And so just by pure survival,
that's not a bad idea.
You're using the inherited wisdom of those that did survive and go, okay, I'll inherit those practices and minimize my risk of disease.
Yep. But there is, he is also right to say that that's essentially just a moral prejudice, right? Because there's another way of looking at it saying, well, you may be weakening yourself in some way by avoiding these things, because exposure to the harsh parts of life actually toughens you up. And it implies that you think there's something intrinsically bad about those things that you dislike because you're trying to avoid suffering, right? But if the knightly caste are like, well, actually, we kind of like those things because they're part of the physicality of life and they make me stronger. They make me more experienced. They're me embracing worldliness. But you can see the distinction that he's making there. The priestly case is kind of, there is a kind of hostility to the fleshy and realistic bit of the world in favor of a kind of state of affairs that is, I don't say unnatural, but it is kind of unnatural. It's deliberately imposed by your refined actions.
It's the utilitarian belief that we need to minimize suffering versus the existentialist belief where you need to confront suffering head on.
Yes, and he doesn't just condemn the priest for this. He says, well, look, this makes man an interesting animal, if nothing else. But anyway, he then goes on to talk about the knightly aristocratic caste, which is, of course, at complete odds with the priests. They base their power in physicality. You know, they desire war, martial activities, you know, things that are of the world. And so the priests become the most mortal enemies of the knightly caste because they are fundamentally powerless. They don't have that kind of raw physicality. And so they end up losing the wars to the knights. And so they have to enact long-scale plans against the knightly caste. And of course, the knightly caste being the Romans and the priestly caste being the Jews is in his framing. And so he views that the Jews have enacted some kind of spiritual revenge against Rome through the inversion of morality, and that slave morality begins in them. And so it is from this hatred of aristocratic values that Christianity, he thinks, has sprung. And he characterizes Christianity, of course, as a narcotic religion that anesthetizes people, this representing the triumph of the slaves over the masters. So the morality of the common man has won, rather than the morality of the aristocrats. And this slave morality is hegemonic as well. It rejects other moral values. It doesn't accept things outside of itself. And so the noble morality of the knightly class, the aristocrats, the Roman morality, actually has nowhere to go but down if they are to accept any of the moral claims of the slave morals.
So from an evolution perspective of Old Testament from New Testament, you can kind of see his point in saying how if you were to view it from the lens of a conspiracy to revenge yourself upon your slavers, expanding the parameters of the covenant that the Jews had with God to being a universal self-associative moral system where the Romans literally became a constituent of this with Constantine, you could say that was their effort to make them fall under the spell of what he would define as pity. Now, of course, that's, as we said right from the start, that's based on his interpretation of the Beatitudes. So if you would, and also it's based on, I'd almost liken it to, there's no more evidence that a conspiracy of Jews did this than there's a conspiracy of men created the ephemeral patriarchal forces how many years ago, and they're still under the spell. But
so I think the term conspiracy is not the way we should look at this, right?
Okay.
I think obviously I don't think this was intentional, and because it happened over such a long period of time that you can't point to a series of people and say, right, they did this to us.
Yes.
That's not what this is. What I think actually is the universalization of values. It actually is a rational and probably inevitable response, honestly, to the geographic position of Israel and Judah on the world map and the things that had happened to them. Because in about, 900 BC or something, the Egyptians conquered this area. And then in about 700 BC, the Assyrians conquered this area. And then in about 500 BC, the Babylonians conquered this area. Then the Persians conquered this area. Then the Greeks conquered this area. Then the Romans conquered this area. And it was Roman until the Arabs conquered this area. And so what you've got there is for a very long time, a coherent people who actually can't exercise any kind of will to power and are constantly losing control of their own homeland. And by the time of the Romans, there have been lots of Jewish revolts up until this point, and it'd be a lot easier to revolt against a Seleucid or Ptolemaic king than it would be to revolt against the Romans, as we saw in fact, the slave revolts that took place. And it was only under Titus that they really got creamed, and then under Hadrian. And so the desire for an autonomous Jewish state is kind of off the table, right? So that desire has to go somewhere else. And if you combine that with the egoistic nature of Greek philosophy, then actually, it's easy to say, well, Aristotle is very egoistic because he's only talking about yourself. It's like, sure, but that also means everyone.
yeah,
The individual is also the universal. And so if you combine, because in fact, he does say, I see Hellenism in in Christianity rather than Judaism, because of course it's not Old Testament Judaism, which is very parochial. It's only for the Jews. No, it is without a doubt, I think, the influence of Hellenistic values on a people who can't exercise a will to power, can't gain independence, that is inevitable that something like this comes out of it.
I can understand that. I think it's also where he makes a distinction with good, for example, with being as of service to your independent ambitions. And it is good because of that. It's a sort of
Yeah.
circular definition a little bit, but I think if you're trying to distill a definition of good and conflate it with perfect, which obviously the concept of God does, then it becomes an ontological case for, okay, if your values are not universal, it would be better if they were universal, therefore we'll evolve them to be universal. And so I think it's probably those combinations of the two traits which allowed for that moral evolution.
Right. And so from this position, though, he goes on to say, well, look, essentially it's the difference between what is good and bad to a slave and to a master. To the slaves, happiness is a relief from suffering or work.
Yep.
And to the nobleman, he lives for himself and with his own energy. So happiness for him is victory. It is to conquer. It is to aggregate. And so this ends up becoming the difference between bad and evil. So the slave morality is very resentful and resents the nobleman as being evil, but he is also not bad, as in bad being of low quality, evil and good, evil in this particular case, and what the slave's interpretation of good has to mean a good intention rather than good results and good consequence. Right? So the slave views the nobleman as ill-intended because he's going to conquer you and take what you have, even though you can't synonymize that with being of poor quality. And so that's the difference between bad and evil. Bad is about your actual quality, and evil means your intention, your ill will. And I think that's an important distinction. That was what I was having trouble putting my finger on with Adam and Sitch, frankly. And so he likens this to an analogy between the lamb and the hawk, because he points out, well, look, some people are innately superior, and he doesn't mean like, racially superior Aryans or anything like that. That's not what he's saying. He's saying some individuals are naturally conquerors in their minds, but a lot are in fact naturally like lambs. And so it's like a discussion between a hawk and a lamb. To the lamb, that which is least like the hawk is the best, the most good, because of course the lamb gets eaten by the hawk. So anything that doesn't have claws and a beak and eats lambs is very, very good. And so the lamb naturally and understandably hates the hawk because it's predated on by the hawk. But the hawk doesn't hate the lamb. It is merely contemptuous of it. It does not want to be like the lamb. But he says, to demand of strength that it should not express itself as strength makes as little sense as to demand of weakness that it should express itself as strength. As in, to ask the lamb to become like the hawk is as wrong-headed as to ask the hawk to become like the lamb. And so you will always have these natural two classes of moral standings. We have the strong, who want to exercise their will's power and can exercise the will's power. You have the weak, who don't have the ability to exercise a will's power and therefore resent anyone who does.
Yeah, you could almost as well call this frog morality with the tale of the frog and the scorpion.
Oh, yeah,
it's in the nature of the scorpion to sting, and so you cannot resent the scorpion for stinging just because you allowed it on its back, because you're operating under different moral presuppositions.
Yes, and you can be contemptuous of it. You can, you can despise it if you want, but also it just makes more sense to be aware of it.
Yeah, and on the point as well to say about he's not talking about superior races that we would use in the modern vernacular.
No,
he also uses examples of Japanese samurai as also the other examples of what he would say the blonde beast is, for example. You could see where German supremacists among the Nazis would extrapolate the idea of Aryan because it's poorly worded, but he uses cross-cultural examples. Yeah,
he does speak specifically of the sort of Germanic conquering race that took northern Italy and subjugated the darker-skinned pre-Germanic race in southern Italy. He does speak of that example, but it's not exclusive to that.
No.
He's talking about any kind of I nearly said master race there. A group of people who have a master morality.
Yeah.
Ruling class.
Yeah.
Like in India, in anywhere, the Normans in England.
Yeah. But he's also talking from a German frame of reference. And so when that gets garbled with master and Germanic, you can see how, you
can see exactly how the Nazis ended up going, oh, that's a brilliant idea.
Yeah. Obviously not. But
no, obviously not. Obviously we don't endorse anything like
that.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.